Can God have or be a mind? That's what I'm thinking about today. Hi, I'm Wim Sweden and welcome back to my channel. Have you ever stopped to think about thinking? That's called metacognition. The ability to reflect on your own thoughts. It helps us to evaluate what we know, question what we believe, redirect our mental effort, and improve how we reason. Another key mental ability is shifting your attention. Like when you're out walking, listening to a podcast, and then your attention suddenly shifts to an approaching car. Now, my main question is, if there's a God, and that God is all-knowing and unchanging, can such a being engage in metacognition? And can it shift its attention? I'd like to explore with you what happens when we try to combine the concept of divine perfection with the properties of conscious thought. So, metacognition is thinking about thinking. And as I said, it allows us to recognize when we might be wrong, evaluate or deepen our understanding, shift our focus based on what's important. So it's a very dynamic and constantly changing process. But then we look at the classical theistic God. Can such a God engage in this kind of mental activity, given that classical theism describes God with some of the following core attributes? God is said to be omniscient. He knows everything, past, present, and future without error. He is immutable. The being cannot change or develop in any way. He's also said to be perfectly simple. The being has no parts or internal distinctions. So its knowledge, will, and being are identical. They're not separate things. And the being is also fully actualized. There is no unrealized potential. There's nothing to become. There's no process of becoming. There is no will or thought still left unexpressed. So these attributes seem to suggest that God cannot engage in reflection. Humans reflect to check for those mistakes, to improve our reasoning, to learn something new. But for such an alleged divine being, there is no possibility of error. There is no room for improvement. There is no new knowledge to gain. There's no new perspective to take. This divine mind is fully actualized and omniscient. It doesn't reconsider or self-reflect. Its thoughts don't move from not considered to considered. They simply are, eternally and completely. Also, divine simplicity rules out breaking thoughts or the mind into parts. There is no distinction between this thought versus that thought to reflect on, or past thoughts versus present thoughts. There's no distinction between a belief that God holds and God's judgment of it. There's not even a distinction between God as a knower and the content of its knowledge, between God as a thinker and the content of its thought. There's only one unified state of knowing, timeless and unchanging. So how can there be metacognition if there's nothing to revise, revisit, or even distinguish? Can such a being even be said to engage in thinking at all, for that matter? Equally important for human awareness is the ability to be selective in our attention. We focus on one thing, filter out other things that are not relevant at the time, but then, over time, shift our focus as needed. According to neuroscientist Michael Graziano and his attention schema theory, also shortened AST, consciousness arises from the brain's internal model of attention. It's a model of what we're focusing on, when and why. This simplified attention model or schema that the brain constructs enables it to track its own focus and creates the subjective feeling of conscious awareness, an I. Even if Graziano's AST is incomplete, it aligns with a broader consensus. Consciousness involves selective shifting attention. But for a purported divine mind, nothing is filtered out. Nothing comes into focus. Everything is known eternally. That there is no new object to focus on. There is no shift in priority. So if divine attention never changes, what would awareness even mean in this context? If God lacks the ability to shift attention, because the being knows or apprehends everything equally, then it has no selectivity, no changing point of view, or any particular point of view at all, and thus arguably no subjectivity? To me, this also leads to a problem when it comes to arguing for creation. What about the thought of and subsequent act of creating? If God is eternally complete, without potential, then how could there ever be a transition from not creating to creating the universe? That shift, that transition, implies a shift in attention, a new priority, a new intention, all of which suggest change, precisely the thing that classical theism denies. But didn't God decide to create? If yes, then what changed in God's mental state? And once the being had created, how did it still not have a change in point of view? Me, speaking as God here, me as a being by myself versus me as a being next to the thing I created. If nothing changed, then creation was always inevitable and unchosen, a brute fact, not a free conscious act after a shift in focus from being content all by itself to then shifting to a state where it is deciding to create. But classical theism still insists that God is both free and personal, capable of making real choices. That conscious choice to create, which theists insist was a true choice and could have been otherwise, implies attention, focus, a shift in perspective. And that seems incompatible with a being that is eternally static, omniscient, and fully actualized. If God's knowledge never changes, never updates, and contains no unrealized potential, then it starts to resemble not a mind, but a perfectly frozen database. A fixed eternal fact, not a living conscious process. If conscious minds are inherently dynamic, does it make sense to describe this being as conscious? If the statement, God has or is a mind, turns out to mean God has or is something totally unlike a mind, then the claim becomes, to me at least, semantic vapor, carrying no real content. At this point, the problem for me sharpens into a paradox. If God is conscious, as many theists claim, then this consciousness must include features like selective attention, so the ability to shift perspective and to consider something as well. After all, these are core elements of all the conscious minds we have ever encountered. Even more basically, consciousness requires subjectivity, a point of view. But a point of view changes depending on context. To take a new stance is to adopt a new relation to the world. As I said previously, before creating the universe, God would have had the point of view of not yet creator, and after creation, now the creator. That's a shift in perspective. Even this basic change implies an internal distinction, a before and an after. Or if you don't like the temporal language, a with and without perspective in the divine mind. But classical theism rules that out. On the other hand, if God is immutable and fully actualized, then none of these dynamic processes can occur. There is no shift of focus, no new perspective, no before or after, no change in relations. There is no model being updated, no awareness that moves from one object to another. This divine mind, if it exists, must be eternally identical to itself, containing no unfolding, no flow, and no difference between thinking, feeling, and being. This to me leads to the deeper contradiction that a mind with no shifts, no perspective, no distinctions, no selectivity, is not recognizably a mind at all. And that puts the idea of a personal God under serious strain. If the divine mind is just a timeless fact, a complete and changeless unity, then it lacks everything that makes a person. It would be more accurate to describe it as a logical structure or an abstract totality, not a self-aware being. The price of preserving divine perfection, it seems, is surrendering personhood. Talking about personhood, there's an extra layer of complexity here for certain types of Christians. So I want to go on a bit of a tangent. Please indulge me. We've been exploring metacognition and attention, and how those relate to the God of classical theism. But what happens when we take this conversation into Christian Trinitarian theology, specifically into the Christian claim that God became human in Jesus? Here's an intriguing lens to view this through. A famous thought experiment known as Mary's Room. Philosopher Frank Jackson imagined a scientist, Mary. She knows everything about color, its physics, how humans perceive it, everything. But Mary, the color scientist, has lived her entire life in a black and white room. she has never seen colour. When she finally leaves the room and sees the colour red for the first time, does she learn something new? Many argue yes. She gains first-person experience, aka qualia, of what it means to see red. Something no amount of objective knowledge could provide. Now, apply this to the story of the incarnation. If Jesus is God become human, did God learn something new by entering the limits of a human mind? Did God, like Mary stepping out of the room, step out of divine static omniscience into the vivid, unpredictable world of lived human experience, of limited attention, inner conflict, doubts, mistakes, learning, regrets, and an evolving self-awareness? If so, that moment of incarnation raises a theological puzzle. If God truly learned something new through Jesus, he changed, contradicting the classical idea of divine immutability. But if he didn't learn anything new, then Jesus' experience wasn't truly human. This creates a theological paradox at the heart of Christian belief. But, as I said, that's only a problem for Trinitarians to ponder. To return to the main point, and to conclude, and thank you for sticking with me through that tangent, if metacognition and shifting attention are essential features of consciousness, then a being that is fully actualized, immutable, and eternally complete seems to lack the very structures that make experience possible. Without change, there's no shifting point of view. Without selectivity, there's no focus. Without internal distinction and contrast, there is no self-reflection. And without any of these, what remains can hardly be called a mind in any recognizable sense, let alone a person. This challenges the idea of a personal God not just intuitively but structurally. It suggests that the whole concept may just be a powerful projection. People imagine a cosmic mind by amplifying the features of their own mental lives, self-awareness, intention, thought. But if the divine attributes of classical theism are taken seriously, what we end up with is not a mind at all, but something closer to a frozen logical structure, impersonal and unexperiencing. So the question remains, if this purported being cannot think about its own thoughts, cannot shift focus, cannot learn or change, can we really say such an alleged being thinks at all? Let me know what you think. See what I did there? Can a mind exist without change? And if not, what does that mean for the idea of God? I look forward to reading your comments. See you next time. Bye.